Hi, I'm Ann Gaviola. Welcome to the Peak on Global, where we break down what is trending in the business world and what you need to know to stay ahead of the curve. Joining me now is Brett Chang from the Peak Podcast. Welcome, Brett.
Hey, Ann, great to be with you as always.
Brett, our first story has to do with Canada's plans to welcome 1.5 million immigrants over the next 3 years. But according to a report this week by Desjardins, we are not on track to build enough housing to accommodate. So if you do some basic math, it suggests we need to kick things up into a higher gear when it comes to home building. We need to see the fastest pace of housing starts ever. Now, Brett, as someone hoping to get into the Toronto housing market sometime reasonably soon, what are your thoughts on all of this?
So the Desjardins economics team is doing really great work on this topic. And I think it's an important point that you raised, which is there is just a deficit between the amount of supply that we need to actually house everybody that wants to get into the market. And there's only really one way to correct that, and that's by building more housing. So I think what this is really calling for is for the provincial, municipal, and federal governments to work together to ensure that it's as easy and quick as possible for us to get more housing built in the Greater Toronto Area. And without that, it's going to be a real challenge to house all these people.
Yeah, where have I heard that before? All levels of government need to band together and get rid of some of the friction that stands in the way of building more housing. I also want to talk about something else. This is related to the same topic. Victor Dodig, who is the CEO of CIBC, one of our big banks, warned that an influx of immigrants will set off, and this is, in his words, the largest social crisis over the next decade. Now, I view this from a variety of lenses. I'm an immigrant. My family came to Canada in the early 80s. I'm also someone who studies the economy. I'm observing the very unique labor market trends playing out currently. There's so many industries right now crying out for workers. I recognize how complicated all of this is, and I also think it's important to note that if newcomers are welcome to, for example, the prairie provinces, rather than the majority flocking to southern Ontario and BC, as we've seen in previous immigration waves past, that would put less pressure on home prices in our most expensive urban centers. There is a way to manage this. I wonder if there's the political will to figure this out urgently.
I think one of the challenges is that if you start to force people into different areas, that doesn't really work. They might stay there for a little bit. They might eventually come back to the GTA or the lower mainland of BC or Montreal. And so it's really tough to do that type of placement of newcomers to Canada. But I think it's really important that we continue to bring in more and more people. And you also have to remember that we have a labor crunch right now, as you just mentioned. And the best way to fix that is by bringing in new, younger, working age people who can get in there and take on some of those jobs that we need to actually build more houses and build more transit and all of that really important work that has to be done to accommodate for all these newcomers coming into Canada. But it's absolutely a delicate balance. We want to bring in as many people as possible. I'd love to see Canada hit 100 million people in the next 50 years. But in order to do that, we have to really build up that infrastructure. And so figuring out that labor market issue and ensuring that we have enough people to work those jobs to get that infrastructure built is probably our primary challenge.
Yeah, and part of that delicate balance may be that, people settle geographically, at least for the first few years in some locations, and after that they're free to do as they choose. Let's switch gears to this second topic. It's equally important. The Canadian cannabis apparently is in peril. So that is the message, the words from business leaders, owners and producers in the legal weed space to the federal government. Earlier this week, we saw 5 cannabis CEOs. They held a presser on Parliament Hill calling on Ottawa to rethink high taxes that are imposed on this sector, as well as strict advertising rules. What do you think about this, Brett?
Well, I think what's important to remember is that Canada was the first jurisdiction in the world on a federal level to legalize recreational cannabis. Now, comes with that a lot of experimentation. So is the current framework that the government put in place when cannabis was legalized in around 2018 correct? Well, it got us to this point where we now have a legal recreational market that does service millions of customers. I think a lot of mistakes were made along the way, though, both by regulators and by the companies themselves. The businesses raised billions and billions of dollars under the assumption that there would be this massive demand for cannabis products, which just hasn't really materialized the same way that they thought it would. At the same time, I think the government has been, in many cases, overbearing in terms of taxation and requirements for how the supply chain should look and regulatory compliance issues that they could probably pull back on now as well. And so I think what we need to do is reevaluate every piece of legislation that has been passed on here, look at all the corporate business practices to date, and find a path forward.
Yeah, I guess it's a question of, is this a priority right now? If you ask the industry, they say yes, it absolutely should be. We're in a collective crisis. And if you look collectively at the industry, it has lost more than $131 billion in 2022. They're being hit with all kinds of things, including labor shortages that other industries are grappling with, supply chain issues, as you mentioned, rising input costs because of inflation, all of it. It is a tough time for this nascent industry. I will say it's probably been a surprise to many that other federal jurisdictions have not followed Canada's lead quite as quickly as we might have hoped. I guess the question is it time to cut the industry a break? And remember, shortly after legalization, there was so much hype, there was so much hope around what this industry could be. Are we at a crossroads right now where we need to say, if we've decided to make this legal, we need to evaluate how they go about conducting their business and what kinds of rules are hamstringing them? For example, rules around how they can market themselves. I understand completely the need to limit messaging to children. Completely. You won't get an argument from me there. But when it comes to, the industry's inability to talk about what their products can do, I wonder if that's, a fair thing to burden a business with.
So I absolutely think that there needs to be regulatory change to make it easier for these companies to operate. I think that the original framework that was passed is probably incorrect to what the market ended up looking like. Now, I don't want to let, though, the CEOs and the owners of these businesses off the hook. I was around in 2017 and 2018 when a dream was being sold by these companies that there would be millions and millions of cannabis consumers in Canada, that a variety of different products would have infused cannabis into them, that global markets would be opening up, that other jurisdictions would follow Canada's suit, that in Canada would be a lead exporter in all of that. And that stoked the flames and the hype around this industry that put them in a position where they could raise tens of billions of dollars for these companies, go public, and convince consumer and retail investors that there really was a path forward here to make them rich. And I think that that was ultimately wrong. They had the wrong vision for what the industry should look like. They didn't model it correctly. And now they're kind of bearing the brunt of that, where their valuations are down. Does that mean that you can't have sustainable, profitable cannabis companies in the current regulatory environment that haven't raised billions of dollars? I think that you probably could. It's just going to take a different model and a different business than they've currently built. And so I don't want to let the executives and the owners of these companies off, because they really did sell a false dream. They were just wrong. But at the same time, there definitely needs to be some regulatory change to make these companies operationally a bit easier to run.
Really interesting hot take there, Brett. Okay, and our final story is about monopolies. You and I have talked about this before, from banking to telcos to grocery stores to major airlines. So after months of expert testimony, the Senate released a report that says the lack of competition across Canada will lead to higher prices, will continue to be inflationary. And they could have just watched the peak. I get it. We are a geographically vast country and a relatively small market, especially compared to the US. But I think it is important for people to realize that any way you slice it, barring further government intervention, monopolies do cost consumers. It doesn't mean that there aren't advantages to what seems to be the Canadian way. In fact, having just a few players can, depending on the industry, provide some stability for some very important services. What are your thoughts on this, Brett? Have you changed any of your thinking around this?
Not so much. I think what I reflect on now is that the big problem is consolidation. That if you look at something like the grocery industry, it's been proven time and time again that there can be new players that emerge and find different niches in the market. You can look at, for example, Farm Boy in Ontario, or you can look at Longo's, which existed in the Greater Toronto area, and they built really impressive big businesses. The big issue is that they only did that for so long. At a certain point, they got so big that there was the consolidation with, in Farm Boy's case, Sobeys and Empire, the parent company. And in Longo's case, they joined forces with Loblaws. And I think the challenge is for regulators is that we don't really have a lot of laws that stop companies from doing this. And so we have a very weak antitrust regulator. And so there isn't really anything to stop the companies from consolidating like this. And that's ultimately bad for consumers. I think, in some instances, it's really hard for a new player to emerge in an industry like airlines, for example. But in other ones, it's definitely very possible. And we just have a regulatory framework that doesn't stop that type of consolidation from happening. And that prevents competition, which is ultimately worse for consumers. So I think that really needs to change. And if we had a more aggressive antitrust regulator, a lot of this consolidation would stop and customers would have more choice.
Super great insight. Thank you for your time as always, Brett.
Thanks so much, Anne.
and you can get all your daily business news with the Peak Daily Podcast. It is available for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.